Thank you all so much for joining us here today. When you're competing with almost 50-degree weather in Chicago, it's hard to be virtually engaged, but thank you all so much for spending your time with us. We're really excited to be in conversation today with Moises and Elvia. I'm going to tell you a bit about our two featured speakers today, and they're going to be doing some awesome makeup demos and having a great conversation and talking about their work as well too. So you guys are definitely in for a treat. Moises Salazar is a non-binary queer artist from and in Chicago. They currently attend the School of the Art Institute of Chicago undergraduate program. I believe they actually finished this program, where they primarily focus in ceramic sculpture and painting. Being born queer and to immigrant parents has cemented a conflict within Moises' political identity, which is the conceptual focus of their practice. The work of Moises Salazar is meant to showcase the trauma, history, and current state that undocumented immigrants and queer folk face. It is by examining the intersections of race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, queerness, and the United States history that Moises addresses the reality of the barriers that immigrants and queer individuals face with the intention to begin to dismantle the myths and stereotypes used to criminalize and dehumanize them. We also have Elvia Carreon. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Forgive me if I didn't. Um, she is an interdisciplinary artist based in Chicago. She graduated from the Art Institute of Chicago in 2020 with a primary focus in painting and art therapy. She documents family dynamics, memory, celebration, and queerness through adornments such as folkloric wear, hair clothing, jewelry, and animal print, along with chafa objects, cheap plaster replications to decor the Mexican households. She uses these familial materials to destigmatize craft and Latinx art and works to honor them as they provided her first studio teachings, such as weavings and altar installations. She uses folk materials to showcase intimate experiences with her family and investigates the way oral narrative influences intergenerational bondings. This form of chisme or gossip culture shapes the information shared in her work and further explores the nuances of machismo, language, trauma, immigration, religion, romance, and sexuality. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Moises and Via.
Hello. I thank you so much for being here again. Thank you, High Park Center, for hosting us. I'm so excited to be presenting this programming. Just a little bit about the structure. I am about to present my work, and then Elvia, and then followed up with sort of a um, podcast style conversation between me and Elvia as we do our makeup and glam, and adornment is very important in our work. So we're gonna sort of use that as a format to sort of bring out conversations, which is a lot how me and Elvia talked to begin with. I've known Elvia as a friend, artist, colleague for many years now. So I'm very excited to begin. Thank you so much. I will start by sharing my screen. All right. Ooh, I'm not sure if. Oh, can everyone see the like? Is it big or is it small? I guess because it looks kind of funny on my
Yeah,
end.
you will have to go to slideshow and present.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm like it looks a little. Wait, just let me. Sorry, Zoom is not my forte.
It's all good.
All right. There you go. That's how it needs to look.
Yes. If you go
Right, slideshow.
slideshow,
And...
play from start. There we go.
All right. So my yeah, my name is Moises Salazar. I'm they them. I'm from Chicago. I always like to begin with these two images. They are my two grandmothers. The woman in wearing blue holding the baby, and then my other grandmother on the right. They were sort of the anchors for my parents to come to the U.S. Both of my parents across the border in the late 80s. And sort of my grandmother, Inocente Rodriguez, to the right, was sort of the person who paid for it and funded them. And my grandmother from my mom's side, which is the woman holding the baby, she also helped them financially and sort of stabilize them. And I think when we talk about sort of narrative of immigration, I always like showing this idea because both of these people were very influential for my existence, and I was only able to meet one of them here, my grandmother who became the anchor here. But my abuelita Teodora, she still supported my family even, from Mexico. Um, that's me, very young. Growing up on the 63rd and Kedzie here in the south side of Chicago was a very to immigrant parents, and learning and speaking Spanish first. Sort of was a very interesting experience at the time. A whole bunch of immigrant families are sort of pouring into these communities. That there were sort of had more, I guess, like housing availability, because there were more, I guess, more houses that were cheaper to buy. So I grew up in this area, and just for an idea for those folks, Puebla is sort of a little way. It's like almost like 2 hours out of Mexico City, so it is south. And my parents sort of went through the through Mexico, then to Tijuana and so forth, and then drove to Chicago. Um, so that narrative of immigration is very important in my work, and it sort of fueled this body of work called Cuerpos Desechables. If you're not aware, and I think most people now, because of our past administration, is aware of the horrible situation that undocumented immigrants find themselves in detention centers. Years ago, if you were ever detained, you were very quickly deported within basically like 48 hours. But now we sort of have this system in place that is very similar to the prison system, where folks are sort of being detained for long periods of time. Some people have disappeared in detention centers, and it's these are earlier images of some of the first ones that sort of have come out. They have now have created different styles, in big tents. A lot of those were done during the Obama administration. Um, so as someone that grew up with undocumented parents, my fear was always the fact that my parents were going to be detained, and that's sort of a lot of my anxieties surrounding U.S. identity has sort of centered around this idea that I still have sort of vulnerabilities. And this whole series has, became, I guess, it came out of my necessity and sort of my anger and anxiety around how many children were being put in detention centers, because of the huge influx of unaccompanied immigrant children, and the idea that we're in a country that this still happens. It's happening now as we speak, and the fact I think use my privilege as an artist to sort of make people understand the complexities that go with choosing one to immigrant to another country, and sort of like the trauma that goes into that, leaving family behind. The fact that my parents have never, ever since being, have never seen their family. A lot of my parents' family has passed away without them seeing, and I think. I believe that as much if we start understanding sort of those narratives, that folks will sort of understand how hard it for someone to make that journey and that decision, and also to sort of decriminalize it, because I feel like a lot of folks still understand that this is sort of like a crime, that there's an easy way around, I guess, like there's a logistical way of coming to this country. But when you're these are images of my pieces in my parents' pueblo. If these are spaces that sort of are very, if we think about poverty here, in the US, the gap of poverty in Mexico in some of these spaces is just vast. It's not even, there's no comparison. So I think that I've been very lucky that I sort of been able to use this narrative and my own privilege of being in the U.S. to sort of say some of these stories and very much confront folks about these things that are still happening. Um, and at the same time, I growing up gay and then now non-binary, within a Mexican household framework, has also influenced a lot how I exist. These are sort of I do these series at the same time. In the beginning, very much separated, where I sort of found my queerness in institutions and sort of within the art world, and I've been making a lot of sort of these what I call glitter paintings, that are sort of representative of sort of my own body, and sort of looking at what does it mean to be male. And when I sort of reached this moment where I wanted to intentionally let go of maleness, and I was like, how does that look like? How do I find attractiveness within myself? How, especially in a way that language has sort of formed both in English and Spanish. How do I sort of begin to create a new language to describe myself? And at that time, I guess, being the person I am, it became visual before I guess verbal. So a lot of these images are about things that have happened in my life, and playing with masculinity, femininity, sort of deciding that talking about both, neither. And it's sort of like a language within myself of sort of trying to capture these figures, of myself and sometimes of my family, and important, I guess, queer folk in my life. Like, this is one of my queer parents, who's someone that's basically my age. But this, I think I sort of been wanting to record some of the ways that sort of, the similarities of how queer people exist and sort of create community, because that's very familiar with the way that, we do that sort of in Mexican community and within my family. The last images that I'm going to be presenting, um, or sort of have become the new amalgam of my work, where it's both talking about immigrant. I guess I've always wanted to separate the both because of insecurities within, immigrant communities and queer spaces, where I feel like some queer spaces are not ready to talk about Mexican identity or immigrant identity, and some immigrant communities are not ready to accept queerness and talks about femininity and masculinity. And in the beginning, like I said, I separated them both, but now I've been very much intentionally sort of, and merging them, and basically saying, this is idea of, I have, what I consider like a queer sensibility to material, color, and sort of like, I guess, like my own labor in that regard. And I sort of been doing these sort of pieces that are about both. They're about forgiveness, they're about repent, they're also about, honoring this sort of like masculine past and my childhood, and also critiquing it, in some of the homophobic and very toxic masculine spaces that I sort of had to coexist with my relatives. So I have fun and I play with a lot of these materials. Like, they're meant to be kind of absurd, sexy, and sort of using a language that's more familiar to what I would consider sort of growing up low income in a Mexican household, in a Mexican community. So they're about vaqueros, botas, and bautizos, and trying to find a space, and that's sort of what my work is meant to do now, I would say. So I am that. That was my quick presentation. I'm gonna throw it over to Elvia.
Thank you, Moises.
No
Okay.
problem.
Okay. Can everyone see? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us once again. And my name is Elvia Carreon. And so for me, I really want to start off talking about my grandmother, mi abuela Petra Cabrales. She is the matriarch of my family and probably the biggest influence that I have in my work and my own personal life. And she is from Tacualeche, Zacatecas, which I've never actually been there. But Tacualeche is very interesting because it's a small rural city and it's divided between indigenous people and then the more colonial areas of the city. So it is very divided. And she has always rejected her indigenous roots, which is why I don't actually know about her city. And I feel like a lot of women, especially in Mexican American communities, they always have to leave their families, they have to leave their spaces once they get married. And that's exactly how I felt when my grandma would talk about her history, which is why oral narrative is such a big aspect in my work. So I've actually had the opportunity to work with my grandma in a lot of projects. And this is a film project that I did with her where I actually would follow her throughout her day. And so in the beginning, we see a lot of her morning rituals, which I'm calling them rituals and performances, in just her, cooking and, slicing the meat and washing clothes. There is a technique and a certain way that she carries herself. And then at night, she does a lot of the more spiritual chores. For example, egg rituals, which egg rituals are very prominent in a lot of Mexican communities, which is a sense of healing. In this case, she was healing one of my cousins who was pregnant and had mal del ojo. She had a bad spirit. And so I've always admired my grandma because I do see her as my first artist. And for me, that's really important in my work. This is one of her altars that she has in her house, and she always keeps adding whatever she can find, toys, or there's like a baby Yoda somewhere in there. But for me, it's really important to examine a lot of what is considered craft and folk art in Mexican communities. I really want to work to destigmatize a lot of the way that folk art is portrayed in westernized spaces. For me, this was really like my first studio teaching. Uh, Altars were my teachings for installation work. It was really the first time I got to examine composition at such a young age and really appreciate the craft of a large scale installation like this. And so for me, because my grandma was such an important aspect of my work, I implemented a lot of the practices that she taught me into my own practice. And so this piece is called Abuelita Prayers. This is something that I would put in my own altar for her as a way of worshiping her and what she has taught me. And then here we have Abuelita y Yo Bloodline, which is a dress that my mom gave me, but it belonged to her. And so my mom kind of unites my grandma and I. And so these were just some of the pieces that really I continue to revise even in my own work right now, because I have shifted a lot from this narrative. So even though I really appreciate and love what my grandma has taught me, um, there are other aspects of my identity that have been a bit conflicting in regards to my relationship with my grandma. And so at a young age, I really had to adapt to a lot of heteronormative structures. One of the first things that I really had to uh, question was my own agency for my own body. And so I was always required to wear my hair long. I wasn't allowed to cut it for religious reasons. And this was a practice of Marianismo, which is not talked about a lot. I think most people talk about machismo, but Marianismo plays a big role in Mexican American communities. It basically requires a woman to have a certain role in order for machismo to work out. Women are expected to have superior morality, purity, and carry themselves with daintiness and femininity, which is why Marianismo, comes from the Virgin Mary. And so I was also in folkloric dancing, and that really changed the way that I saw myself. I was required to have long hair and braided hair all the time, except for religious ceremonies like this, which was my confirmation. But other than that, I was required to always wear braids. In folkloric dances, I was required to have a very specific image of femininity that I wasn't very comfortable with. I was also required to walk and navigate a space of celebration and dance and in a heteronormative way that I wasn't comfortable with. But at the same time, I had appreciation for certain elements. And so this is where I think my queerness and my Latinidad really intersect. And I really had to reassess the way that I viewed those two identities because they cannot work exclusively. And I knew that it came from a young age. And so I started to really reassess uh, my identity. And so here we have the Trenza series, which is a relief print series. I cut my hair on my own without my mom's permission. And I had those braids. And so I collected those braids and also uh, clothing that I was attracted to. And so I was not allowed to wear like animal print because that was exclusively for the men in my family that would have them in belts or boots, the vaquero boots. And so I took those pieces of adornment and I really started to print them over and overlapping. And it started to become a little bit more clear uh, the way that I wanted to portray myself. And so here we have, braids and then animal skin. And I really felt like this project was therapeutic for me because it made me delve in a little bit more into my queer identity, but still not negating the aspect of my Latinidad. So here we have a piece that's called Trencitas y Chismes. And I started to really look back at really fond moments that I had with women in my family. I didn't want to grow a sense of resentment. I wanted to look at aspects like chisme culture, which is really big in my work. And so chisme means gossip. And it's basically, sharing information or what's going on in your life. And I think it's really important in my work. And so here we have trenzas, the braids. And so each braid is color coded. So for those in my family that are American, there are the red and blue braids. And then those that were born in Mexico, they have the green and red braids. And then also I wanted to implement a little bit of humor in this piece. Uh, like nicknames is an aspect of chisme culture. La flaca, which means the skinny one. La papachada, it means the spoiled one. La gemela, the twin. It makes it much more intimate. I feel that language does have a sense of membership where I think, those that are part of the Mexican American community or speak Spanglish, right, would be able to relate and identify and really feel connected. And the way that I installed this was on top of two plaster columns. And so I really gravitate towards what is considered chafa. It means like really cheap, tacky decor, and I love it. I love the glamour in it. And so I know it's always treated as something inferior, but I see really like the beauty in it. And so, yeah, and this installation piece was for my BFA. And so this piece, it's called Deja mi trenza, ama. It means like leave my braid alone, mom. And so when I cut my hair, it was actually a really big deal in my family, especially in relation to my mom, because she really had this sort of attachment to my hair because it was the way that I presented my femininity. And so I made this piece for her, a letter, a love letter to her, because on one hand, I do love and appreciate, certain aspects of adornment that were brought to me, like ribbons and these beautiful bold colors of red and pink, which are colors of honor, in folkloric wear. But at the same time, I needed a space and I needed some sort of agency on my own body and how I wanted to treat my own image and my own hair. And so this is where I am at now. And so this is a series that's called Rezos Peludos. And it's sort of
Because
it's
I love this. Keep going.
sorry, it's okay. It's it's a rosary made out of my hair, and so it's my own braided rosary. I wanted to create my own sacred objects, because, like Moises explained, when you're queer, you have to almost create your own community and your own home. And so for me, these are sacred objects and almost like heirlooms, um, for um, for my own home and my own space. And also, hands are really important when you're doing the rosary and the way that you read it. And so for me, peludo has like a double meaning because I'm showing like my own arm hair, and at the same time trenzas. And for me, something small like that is a really big step for me personally because arm hair is not seen as very feminine or appropriate. And so to have these two, um, these two pieces of hair, my braid and my arm, um, really, really show my queer identity, but still not leaving or negating the aspect of my Latinidad. Okay, and that is pretty much it, guys. Thank you.
Thank you for the Alvia. You said so many. I guess now we're gonna be doing our makeup while we are talking, and we invite folks if they want to put on a little eyeshadow. We're gonna or just giving some eyeliner.
You
Filling
guys
your
can
eyes up,
join
perhaps,
us too.
and some lipstick. Um, but Elvia, you said so many. You were saying just words and phrases that I was just like, this is it. Like I think a lot about the idea that you said, where it's like I don't want to be resentful. That really gathered me up because I think that it's something that it's really hard, especially when it's like our parents or growing up and it's so funny because like I don't want to be resentful towards myself, even things that I put myself in, and then I don't want to be resentful towards my family or even like this country. Like I think that that's such a I'm not sure if it's exclusively queer or maybe like if it's gendered or whatever, but the idea that um I've heard that before from like my parents and like from my sisters, where it's like, like if you have a fight with a family member, it's like, oh, get over it because you cannot be resentful. It's almost like it's interesting because it's like I think for me for a long time being resentful was the way for me to have agency. But now I'm in a
Mhm.
space where what you're saying just like feels like that, like it is true. Like I love my parents. They're great. I admire them for their labor. And they will always be that for me. But there's things
Yeah,
that they've done continuously do that I sort of had to like catch up on and and call them out on. But I was like, Alvia, you really you said it so in such a manner that it made me understand.
and I think it's so easy to be resentful.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for me, for a while in my work, when I started basically to accept my queerness, my work started to become much more aggressive, and I didn't like who I was becoming as an artist. Yeah, but at the same time, I knew that it was coming from a place of trying to almost like accept yourself,
Yeah.
um, but at the same time, building this sort of resentment with your family.
You know, I agree. And I think even going back to this, like, another thing that you said that I really just like I want to acknowledge is the fact that you said you have to create your own sacred objects. Because I think I've been doing a lot of that with the images that I make, you know. I think that the paintings that I enjoy, that like I like my own work, if that makes sense, you know. And I think that religion, I mean, and this isn't like, let's talk about religion, but growing up in a very my parents' morals and values were aligned with a specific way of thinking that's very influenced by a colonial, organization that has taken over and completely, culture
Rampant.
culture that's considered now
Yeah.
Mexican culture. Um, it's like always enjoy the way that we honor, and by we I mean, Mexican households, like ofrendas, the way that we speak, regarding even in language, like how we regard adults, like all that stuff. Like there's certain parts of it that I've loved, but I've never sort of identified with it. Like when we talked about the Virgin Mary and some of the saints, I'm like, it's not like this isn't it. This can't be it. Like this cannot, like what they represent and the narratives. I'm like this. I guess like very young, and maybe you had a similar experience. Very young, I always understood like this cannot just be it. Like there has to be more than this, and I think that very much kind of like ostracizes you. I know it did me. Like it very much made folks be like, what are they on? Like what's wrong with them, because I was very much like interested in things of what we consider now, even like I think chafa is a good word, but the idea of like the cheap, like I used to love going to like the mega mall and seeing what you consider, those very, I mean,
Like,
very revealing dresses that
oh,
women would wear to the club, and I would see that and be like, that's so glamorous, like that's so, it looks so nice,
yeah.
and those were the sort of, I guess, like the aesthetics that I always love seeing. And even in TV, like those were the characters that I identified with, that were usually like the villain or the person that had their like comeuppance. And I'm like, oh my god, like they're so glamorous. They're people, they're folks, usually femme identifying, or at least femme presenting, that
Hmm.
were sort of doing what they wanted, and they were just like, who cares about whatever. And the villain aspect would be that the fact that they had agency and they wanted to have revenge and they wanted to do those things, and I was always like, why are they the bad person? and
Do you,
you and I think that that sort of has influenced the way that I sort of now navigate. And it's funny because when I started, I think it's important why we're doing our makeup while we're doing this, is because like that's a lot way how we have like learned from each other, especially as someone that went from masculine to non-binariness. It was such a learning curve for me. Like I think it was easier for me to sort of, not that it's a drastic change, not saying that feminine to masculine is not drastic, but there is this idea that there was these sort of things that I had to like I felt pressured sometimes to say, if I don't want to seem masculine, I have to do the opposite, which is femininity. But for me now, I don't necessarily consider that the opposite. I think the way when we talk about some of these binaries, like I still find myself sort of making those judgment calls, and I'm like, that's not necessarily it, they're not an opposite. They're not, they. I think a lot about I guess like sort of if I'm committing to this idea of non-binariness or sort of living outside of that, I think that I still sort of sometimes hold myself accountable, like with the way that we speak about those things. It's really hard, you
yeah.
know,
Hmm.
and sometimes it's something that I know we and you always talk about, is that there isn't any necessarily like elders that we can sort of talk about these things. And I think that that's such a huge part of why a lot of us were on the struggle bus growing up,
Yeah.
because no one's teaching us these things. And it's funny because I always laugh that my queer mom is like, a year younger than me, and like a foot shorter than me. And but there's this idea that she found her queerness and she wasn't able to sort of evade it very young, versus myself, I very much was able to, mimic masculinity, even if I didn't want to. Like I just naturally did.
Yeah.
Um, so I had, I was able to sort of exist without being bothered too much. It was until I sort of, again, I wanted to have more agency. I wanted to look a certain way that I felt like I was. That's when people were like, "Hey, wait a minute," You're like, "Wait," and I don't know if you had a similar experience like that. And I think that influences our work.
For sure. I think for me, I'm still kind of like how you were saying that you were struggling to basically or exist out of this binary or starting using even other like terminology.
Hmm.
I'm still kind of, I think, honestly, at the beginning of that. I still find myself all the time trying to be the opposite of what I think, um, as a way, I guess, to resist. But something that has really helped me, kind of what you were saying, is kind of creating these new roles, these new family members, and speaking with this sense of I know you've mentioned this, but this sense of tenderness with your own um, within your own community. I find myself even like the way that I view this nurturing role in a different way uh, within my group of friends, the way that we speak to each other.
Hmm.
I think it's so important to not only have kind of these queer idols, but queer idols that are also, Latinx,
Yeah.
um, because you also get to talk about certain issues that are very specific to our own community. Like you mentioned, immigration. Um, I know with my group of friends, I don't have to explain a lot of terminology. I don't have to explain like machismo. They just get it. I don't really have to explain,
They're like, we
all
don't
of
just
the.
get it, we live through it.
Yeah.
we survive it. And I think that's important too,
Yeah.
you know? And I love that you brought up the idea of like tender, because I think, and it's funny because when I look at the way that you make work and the way that I make work, we're very tender towards the subject matter that we talk about. I think because we were within certain, and this might be universal, our experience are based, we're assuming this is exclusively, a Mexican gendered household. Um, but I think that because we were always sort of, we always had to do what we were told in ways like, and it goes even to things like going to my uncles and saying, bendición, which is basically when you leave, you have to say hi. When you get there, you have to say hi. You have to ask for bendición. And there's like, I remember a lot of, now me and my sister, we talk about these things where it's like there was uncles and adults that she was like, these aren't even my family members, and she had to sort of be the person that was receiving, this bendición from folks that, don't, just because, again, a lot of the ways that we think is just because. And I think now the way we even we like approach material, we're very careful with it. Like, I don't know if I've always been told, like with my work or my piñatas, like, why don't you destroy, why don't you destroy them in a performance? Like, why don't you,
Mm,
do crazy stuff with glitter, or, like, cover yourself and all these things? And to me, like, that's such a very, and I want to say, the opposite of gender isn't necessarily violence, but to me, that's a very like intense gesture that I'm just not that kind of person. I don't know if that's sort of, I'm assuming that it's kind of, maybe it might be influenced by the way that I had to exist. Um, but I find myself, and I see that within your work a lot, where it's like the way that you approach material, you're very careful. And even the way that you're describing your hair, like as a material, like you're very careful and you're very tender. Um, in that. And I think sometimes when, I don't know about you, but when we talk about the idea of like being radical, in the way, and as an artist, I always felt sort of on the outside of that conversation,
mm,
because I wasn't one of those folks that's like, I guess sometimes I felt pressured to be like, you're with certain, within queer white spaces, to be told you have to be radical because that's your job. But I think sometimes they don't acknowledge that what we're doing is radical. the fact that we're present or even speaking on these issues, that is radical. And I think that the way that, that we become very tender, and like it's nice to see that reflective in other folks.
Yeah, I think our existence in itself, just the fact that we're creating queer art is political. I mean, whether it's perceived as it or
Yeah.
not.
Did you have this thing that when you started making work that was, we both come from work that is, quote unquote, on the lines of speaking of immigration. Did you ever, when you start making work that was more about identity or gender, did you have people go like, I don't know, sis, like maybe, because I did. I think, some of the work that obviously I didn't show because I don't think it's representative of the way that I work. As I used to paint, I used to be an oil painter and paint. You see some of my paintings where they were exclusively like realistic paintings of folks in my community, friends, family. And then when I did the switch to glitter, and there were like nudes and, and bodies, my own body, really out there, even though it wasn't necessarily me per se, but like a queer body in glitter, people were like, oh, like I that's different, and it's funny because sometimes I would find myself being really anxious about showing people my work within the immigrant community sometimes when I would meet folks on the street or future people that I would collaborate with, um, because I think it's, approach people who approach you for your work or wanting to talk about your stuff is very different than you approaching them. And I think I always want to introduce my community, and I don't want my community to feel like they cannot be a part of the conversation or my exhibition. But sometimes it's hard because I feel pressured. Like a lot of the pressure that comes from me, where it's like, I'm scared to show you this other, I guess, aspect of it. Now, not as much, but before it was definitely like a big deal for me.
Well, when you started doing, especially like your glitter pieces, were you hesitant to show your
Yes,
family?
yes. Even on social media, I made those um in 2 years ago when I came out. Oh, I guess more than that. No, yeah, 2 years ago when I came out as non-binary, I made those paintings. I made like seven small ones, like this big, um, and I made them in a single week. And I didn't show them. Like they were just for me. It was a very kind of like tender moment of like I almost like I don't want people to consume this, and I don't want people's opinion on these things, and I just want to make these things. And I started making them just on my own, like at home. I would buy, I was very, very new to that stuff. And then I started showing a couple of my faculty and friends and queer folk that I know, and they were like, "These are really nice. You should make more. You should make them bigger." I mean, in the beginning, I was super hesitant because I'm like, I don't want this to be, another aspect of my practice. Like this was just such a beautiful thing for me to do. And I started doing both, and then I realized, at least for me, I don't know if you struggle with this, but sometimes early on I felt like there was work that I had to make because of my privilege and my identity and sort of where I'm coming from, and work that I wanted to make. And I think the glitter work was very like a huge step in the direction of like, this is work that I feel like I have to make and I
Mm.
want to make. And it felt really like authentic. And I think that sometimes, at least for me, like I value some of those things, um authenticity towards myself, because those were things that I felt like I didn't know I had agency over.
Yeah, I think both of our works to a certain extent, right, talk about glamour, um, especially in the context of queer and Latinx identities. Are you ever like fearful? Because this is what I'm fearful of your artwork, like being commodified or seen as like an aesthetic, or you
Yes.
know.
I mean, I think I don't know. I've been, I guess this is a tricky question because these are things that I'm thinking about constantly. I will say my work is very nice to look at. They're beautiful, like they're glitter, they're dazzled, they are works that are nice. And they're me, So I think sometimes it's funny when I see that, folks that are outside of my identity
Yeah.
buy them, or, that I've always think about those things like, do you understand the complexities of, it's not just an image of a brown person in glitter behind fur. You know, it took so much more to
Yeah.
get to that point, and I feel like I think it is true that sometimes I feel like people don't get it. But you know, that's I feel like a conversation about like how do you survive as an artist, you know? And I think that there's definitely more conversation around the idea of like how do we make work that isn't, you know, I guess I combat that by not just accepting offers that I get, or if a collector's interested in my work, I'm like, okay, let's sit down and talk about this. Like, let's sit down and tell me and explain to me why you see why you want, you know, to be interested in my work. And the folks that sort of understand that and they sit down with me and they make the time for me, that ends up being the spaces that I sort of collaborate with. And folks who are like immediately like, oh no, like I'm not necessarily interested in doing all that, then I'll be like, well then I'm, you know, my work isn't available at this moment, thank you. But that's just been one way. And
Yeah.
also I'm so sorry, I think our call is going to drop in like a minute. I'm so sorry, but thank you everyone that came. This was so much fun. We didn't finish the eye look, but we were getting there. Uh, Thank you so much, and I hope that you, if you have any questions, reach out to us. I'm sure the Hyde Park Art Center can give us me and Elvia's information. This was great, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for sharing your work. It was so nice to hear more in depth about your practice and about kind of some of your inspiration and your background stories as well. And I really loved seeing you guys in conversation. I wish that we could continue this whole conversation, but there's more where that came from. Like they said, definitely check out both of their works. And we will be tuning into our next program today. It's the continuation of our ground floor symposium. So it is a talk called Chicago as Teacher, and we're going to be talking about mentorship for artists in Chicago and how artists here really mentor each other, no matter what stature or level they're at, and the importance of finding that mentorship as well. And that features Dawood Bey, Jonathan Castillo, and Tiara Coleman, one of our teens. I will drop the link for that chat if you want to move over to that Zoom that's in a completely different area than we are in. But again, thank you all so much for joining us today. Let's see. One second. Here is the link for that. We'll see you over there. Thank you all.
Bye
Thank you.
everyone. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye Elvia. Thank you so much. Bye. Have a good one.
Bye.